So we're going to talk about Bible archaeology. Those of you who know me will know that this is a subject that really excites me. In fact, it's a subject, having looked at it quite closely, is not only intellectually satisfying, but it's also supported my faith. It's strengthened my faith in the things that I've looked at with my family. And what we're going to do tonight is just look at a very short period in history at the time of the Babylonians. That's why we had these opening verses read in the book of Daniel together. So then, if I were, I was talking about, thank you. If I was going to talk to you about archaeology, I can't even see my Bible up here, but hopefully I can memorize most things. We'll see. So if I was going to talk to you about Bible archaeology, can anyone recognize the face of the man on the screen? He was a very famous German archaeologist. So does anyone else recognize this picture? Robert Koldewey, a German archaeologist, and he was digging from 1899 to 1917 in southern Iraq, and he was the one that discovered many of the treasures of Babylon, and in particular he was the one who found the Ishtar Gate. Now, if we look at history, it's really interesting that this took place at this time, because at the end of the 19th century, Germany as a nation was beginning to flex her international muscles. They would look at Britain and they would look at France, and they could see that they had an empire, an international empire, and Germany wanted something very similar. And now, if you look quite objectively at the history, they say that this was really critical. It's almost a catalyst for the Germany that we know was in the 20th century. What Germany was able to demonstrate to the world, they were able to demonstrate through these archaeological finds of Robert Koldewey, the great scholarship. Scholarship was really important. The great scholarship of Germany, which then actually led into the First World War. Quite amazing. This was all part of Germany trying to impress upon the world its intellectual superiority. And it started, historians tell us, with many of these archaeological finds. And it was an amazing find to find the Ishtar Gate. It was so significant that there was a companion of Robert Koldewey, a man called Delitzsch, Frederick Delitzsch, and he was an Assyriologist, someone who deciphers ancient scripts. And so it was Robert Koldewey and Delitzsch here that were looking at many of these Babylonian treasures, and they translated it. And in 1902, they launched 3 lectures in Germany. And the lectures were electrifying. In fact, the world press picked up what Koldewey had discovered, this ancient civilization of Babylon, the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar, this 70-year period of the 6th century BC, the zenith of the empire. And it drew so much attention that for the first 2 lectures in 1902, the Kaiser of Europe attended himself in person. So you imagine giving a lecture here at Rugby Ecclesia, and Theresa May coming along because she fancied one of the public lectures that had been published. That's the level of attention that it drew. It was quite extraordinary. So that was in 1902. And the title of the series was Babel and the Bible. And in fact, at home, I've got a transcript of those 3 lectures. Amazing times. It's hard to appreciate, isn't it? Over 100 years, finding this ancient civilization. But it really was electrifying. And I want us to try and immerse ourselves a little bit into that period of time and try and excite ourselves. And some of the things that we're going to look at tonight, you can see for yourself at the British Museum. Now, does anyone recognise this place on the screen? And has anyone been there? Berlin, yes. So it's called the Pergamon Museum. It's under renovation at the moment. But the Pergamon Museum is Robert Koldewey's museum, essentially. So all the great bricks that he discovered in Babylon, they house it here in the Pergamon Museum. And it's well worth the visit. So then, just imagine what life was like living during this time. This great golden empire that's described in Daniel chapter 2. There you can see on the screen the Ishtar Gate. And this is one of the ziggurats. Okay, we'll come across that in a moment. But you can see that it was a beauty. It was one of the wonders of the world. Think about London or Paris or New York. This was far superior. It was the largest urban conurbation in the world, and in fact, many of its buildings were higher than any building in the world, with the exception of the pyramids of Giza. Right through to the Iron Age, these buildings were higher than anything else in the world. It was an extraordinary feat of engineering. Now, until Sir Henry Rawlinson and Robert Caldervey in the last century, what's amazing is that it's been Bible students, really, who have looked at the book of Daniel and thought, well, yes, I do believe that men like Nebuchadnezzar lived. And until these discoveries, in fact, it was widely refuted that this history had ever happened, this period of time. You will know, if you go down to the British Museum, there is a room about twice the length of this, with shelves the full length, with bricks of Nebuchadnezzar. Has anyone seen those bricks? All of them stamped with the imprint of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if you go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which is a Jewish-owned museum, which has really an objective in bringing about all the great artifacts that prove that the Jews are a great civilization in their own right. If you go there, there is a room about this size, and it's empty, with one of these bricks on the wall. And everyone in New York, they look at it and think, that's amazing. And I'm always saying, come to the British Museum. You can see thousands of these things. That's how fortunate we are to go and see these things in the flesh, in person. So Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And what we know about this period is that Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, he came down and he destroyed Babylon. And so Nebuchadnezzar spends his lifetime rebuilding and restoring Babylon to its former greatness. In fact, he exceeds the former greatness. And during this building project, he ensures that his name is placed everywhere so that everyone knows that this is his kingdom. Which makes sense, doesn't it? When you think about chapters like Daniel chapter 4, when there is Nebuchadnezzar and he's surveying, isn't he, the great city that he has built. And then he's made a beast of the earth. So there's evidence here that Nebuchadnezzar existed. It's all the way around you. Well, there's certain bricks of the Ishtar Gate in the British Museum. You can also see this at the Metropolitan in New York. But the great reconstruction, as you know, is in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. And that's the original colour of the brick, the glazed brick. In fact, it's described by historians as the jewel in the crown of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. The glazed bricks, they would glisten in the sunshine, reflecting and refracting the rays that bounced off it. And it was a beautiful, beautiful gate. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it 3 times. He was so obsessed in getting it right. It was one of 8 gates around the full perimeter of Babylon. And in fact, it was the greatest of gates. And it's my own personal conviction that Daniel and his 3 friends entered Babylon, probably in their mid-teens at most, through this gate. And what an eyesore it would have been for these 4 young men. So all across the Ishtar Gate were these glazed bricks of mosaics of various beasts that the Babylonians, the ancient Babylonians, worshipped. So here you've got Marduk. Now Marduk was the supreme deity of Babylon. He was the governor. He oversaw all of the city. And this is here the dragon, Sirish. Then you've got Adad, the storm god. So that's related to, we've all heard of Baal. With the prophets of Baal, "O Baal, heal us," and they're calling upon their storm god to respond. Well, the Babylonians had something very similar, and this is Adad. But what's fascinating is that this gate was the great entrance to the kingdom. So it's not like going down to London today, where you can just get a ticket from Virgin Rail and travel down to London and walk around the city and come home. It was very different going to Babylon, because as you went into one of these gates, you read a statement from Nebuchadnezzar. And you had to read this statement. And you had to accept this statement, historians tell us, before you were able to enter in. It's like the terms and conditions of the city. So you went to Babylon on the terms of the king, not on your own personal terms. And this then was at the side of the Ishtar Gate. So those of you who've seen it, you'll know what it says. But it's really interesting. And what I think is really interesting about this is that not only is it a set of terms and conditions, but what this is all about. This is about where Nebuchadnezzar, or how he views himself. How he views himself. Now, when we read the book of Daniel, we see Nebuchadnezzar as the head of gold, the supreme king. And he was. But this tells us something slightly different, because this shows us that he was very much subject to a higher order, not on the earth, but in heaven. Let's just read these words together. So then, this is what you had to read, young people, as you went into Babylon. This is what Daniel and his 3 friends would have had to read. No doubt they would not accept these words, but nevertheless, this is what was written. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the faithful prince appointed by the will of Marduk, that's the supreme, the king god there, the highest of the princely princes, beloved of Nabu. So Nabu was the god of Nebuchadnezzar. We'll come to Nabu in a moment. Of prudent counsel, who has learned to embrace wisdom, who fathom their divine being, and reveres their majesty. Can you see what Nebuchadnezzar is saying? In those quite complicated words, Nebuchadnezzar is thanking God, the gods, that he now fully appreciates their greatness. Isn't that interesting? He's thanking the gods that he now appreciates their majesty. The wise, the humble, the caretaker of Isagila and Izida, the firstborn of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Okay, so this then puts Nebuchadnezzar in his rightful place. He was very much subject to Marduk and his own personal god, Nabu. Now, right across the Ishtar Gate, and we're going to see in a moment the processional way, there were literally hundreds of these lions with eagle's wings. And these were discovered again at the end of the last century by Robert Caldivet. And we don't need to turn to it because I know you're all aware of this, but in the vision of Daniel that he receives in Daniel chapter 7 that describes the nations that are going to come upon the earth until the Lord Jesus Christ establishes himself as king, the first kingdom is described as a lion with eagle's wings. And it's amazing, young people, because when Daniel received this in his dream, he would have looked all the way around him. And he would have seen a lion with eagle's wings. He didn't really need any interpretation for that first kingdom. He knew that he was living in that first kingdom. And I find that fascinating because we read Daniel chapter 7 and we think, well, what an unusual way to describe these nations that would come upon the earth. But when we look at the archaeology, we can see that this was very much in fitting, really, with the period of time. This is how the various gods were represented, the various powers that came and bore upon this nation. Well, I've talked about Nabu. So we have Marduk, and Marduk had a son, and his son was Nabu. And Nabu was the god of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, right? He was the god of learning. And what you have on the screen here, which was really exciting to stand and to see, is actually the facade in Nebuchadnezzar's courtroom. So just here would be the throne of Nebuchadnezzar, and that was the backdrop. So a young Daniel, when he goes in and he interprets the dream of Daniel chapter 2, this is what a young teenager would have seen. He would have seen this. And it's an unusual thing because before I saw it, I wasn't really expecting seeing 70-foot palm trees and flora and fauna. It doesn't go in keeping in my mind with this autocrat, Nebuchadnezzar, a man who made literally decisions around millions of people each and every single day. He was the head of gold. He was the one who determined whether you lived or whether you died. But it all makes sense. Let's just open up our Bibles here. This is the wonderful thing. Archaeology supports what we believe in the scriptures. That's the point. It supports. So, if Nebuchadnezzar has a personal God, and his personal God is the God of wisdom, of culture, of learning, then doesn't it stand to reason that the one thing that Nebuchadnezzar would be most concerned about when he brought these 4 young men into the city of Babylon, let's get them educated. Let's get them educated in the ways of the Chaldeans. That's why we read in Daniel 1 verse 4. Where Nebuchadnezzar, he's talking to Ashpenaz and giving instruction about those that were to be brought out of Jerusalem, brought into captivity, into Babylon. And who are they? Well, they're children in whom was no blemish, we read there in verse 4, but well-favoured, skillful in all wisdom. This was important to Nebuchadnezzar. And cunning in knowledge. Well, that's important. And understanding science. And such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and in whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldean. Can you see the emphasis of education there? Well, it stands to reason, doesn't it? If your God is Nabu. And isn't it amazing that this is the courtroom that was discovered between 1899 and 1917? And if you go down to verse 20, you know the account, don't you? When Daniel stands up and he's 10 times, isn't he? He's 10 times better than the best in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And we read there in verse 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better. And that's why it made such an impression upon Nebuchadnezzar. Their wisdom of all things. If they could show intellectual prowess, this would impress upon the king. So how wonderful that this Bible archaeology in this very courtroom, if you've seen it, it certainly sent a shiver down my spine to see there and to imagine the great conversations that took place and how God was working with Daniel as God worked with Esther this morning in our exhortation. Well, as you go through the Ishtar Gate, you're greeted by the processional way. So those of you who have been to Berlin will see a reconstruction of the processional way. It's half a mile long, and on either side of the processional way are 60 lions with eagle's wings. That is the dominant, right? That is the dominant glazed facade there. So all the way along through the Ishtar Gate is this processional way. And the reason why lion with eagle's wings, because the lion with eagle's wing was a symbol of Ishtar, which again is obviously a symbol of Babylon, right? The symbol of Ishtar. Ishtar, the goddess of fertility and war, all the things that are popular to man's heart. She was adored, she was worshipped, was Ishtar. And so then, you go through the Ishtar Gate, you go through Processional Way, and as you make your way through Processional Way, which was always a great festival that took place each year, a new year where the great gods would go through the Ishtar Gate down to the Processional Way, and they would make their way to the Temple of Marduk, the great temple, which is the great ziggurat. Remember that big building? Just beyond the Ishtar Gate is the Temple of Marduk, the greatest of all the temples in Babylon. Now, before I show you this reconstruction of Col de Ve, does anyone know, or can anyone hazard a guess of how many temples were in Babylon? How many temples did Nebuchadnezzar build during that period of time? 1,197 temples in Babylon, all built by Nebuchadnezzar. And the greatest one was the great ziggurat, okay, which was the Temple of Marduk, the patron god of the city of Babylon. So just bear that in mind. This was a city of false religion. When we look at Daniel, the book of Daniel, we we're really gripped by the imperialism of Nebuchadnezzar, this great head of gold. But if you were living in this city, the thing that you would feel most is the religiousness of it all, right? The false worship, 1,197 temples, all crammed into this city. It was a religious city. Now, those of you who have been to the Pergamon Museum, what you, I'm sure, have noticed is that when you go through the processional way, in the corner of the room is this little square box in glass. And what it is, it's a reconstruction of Babylon. It's like a Lego set, but it's not a Lego set, right? It's an ancient, not a question, right? It's an ancient reconstruction of Babylon. And what's wonderful about it, it was done by Robert Caldervay, so it's been there 100 years. So what he did, based upon his archaeological find, he reconstructs this city, right? So you can imagine it's a bit like a Lego set, but not a Lego set. And this is what it looks like. But you get a real sense of this reconstruction here. Now, what's really, really exciting is at the corner of this box, and every single building is labelled. Robert Caldervay labelled the corner of this reconstruction, this big ziggurat. I was expecting him to say Etemenanke, which I'll talk about in a moment, but he calls it the Tower of Babel. Isn't that interesting that someone who was not even a scripturally minded person names a great temple the Tower of Babel? And this temple that is called the Tower of Babel is the Temple of Marduk. It is the great ziggurat, the greatest of the ziggurats, the biggest building in Babylon. As you go through the Ishtar Gate, as you go down the processional way, you come to this. And for whatever reason, Robert Caldervay called this the Tower of Babel. So I wanted to go and discover a few things for myself. And so then, here's a few things to impress particularly upon the younger ones in the room. Well, this great ziggurat, which we've looked at, this building that Robert Caldervay called the Tower of Babel, it was discovered in 1917. So those of you who like going on Google Earth, you can go on Google Earth and that's what you see today. The archaeological remains of this great ziggurat. And it was called, something called the Etemenanke. And the Etemenanke is a name that Nebuchadnezzar called this great ziggurat. And he calls it the Etemenanke because it literally means, in the Akkadian, the house of the platform between heaven and earth. So this was a great building. It was a great temple that when you looked at it, it looked like a staircase that went to heaven. It looked like a staircase that went to heaven. Now, the reason why I told you about Sennacherib destroyed Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar then set his mind in rebuilding the entire city. From what I understand, with the exception of one building, and this is the building. It is the great ziggurat. And when Robert Caldervay discovered this great ziggurat and this great temple, he came across a plaque. And this is the plaque that Nebuchadnezzar wrote about this great building. And we read here, Etemenanke Ziggurat Babeli, or the Ziggurat of Babylon, right? So it was the great ziggurat. It was the greatest of all the 1,197 temples. He says, the tower, the eternal house, I have completed its magnificence. He goes on to say, it is the most ancient monument of Babylon. I built and finished it. I made it the wonder of the people of the world. I raised its top to heaven, made doors for the gates, and covered it with bitumen and bricks. And so what we know from historians is that this building was exceptional in the great city because the evidence is that it was not rebuilt. It was just restored. And here Nebuchadnezzar says that this building was special because in the whole area of Babylon, this building was the most ancient building. The most ancient. the most historically significant building in all of Babylon. And what he did, he restored it to its former greatness with bitumen and with bricks. So with those thoughts in mind, have a look at Daniel chapter 1 once again, please. I know we just read a couple of verses because a couple of verses will suffice for tonight. Verses 1 and 2 of Daniel chapter 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim king of Judah came Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon unto Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim king of Judah into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. It's interesting, isn't it, that verse 2, with all the political upheaval of what was taking place here, new empire, this new Babylonian empire, the writer Daniel, all he cares about, or what it seems to be anyway, are these vessels. And these vessels were incredibly important, weren't they? Because these were the vessels, the treasures that were placed in the temple in Jerusalem. And without these vessels, the children of Israel could not worship God. So they were critically important for that state of fellowship between God and his people. And we're told here quite clearly that what Nebuchadnezzar did, he takes the treasures out of the house of Yahweh, the temple in Jerusalem, and he places them into, notice, the house of his God, or the temple of his God. And the temple of his God is the temple of Marduk. It was the great temple. But we've also seen that this great temple could well have been the Tower of Babel. There's a loaded phrase there, halfway down verse 2. We're told of all the places that Daniel could have described these events taking place. He uses this phrase in the land of Shinar. And this is a phrase, friends, that had not been used for over 1,000 years. Let's have a look at Genesis chapter 10. This is a phrase that hadn't been used for 1,000 years. And so the writer Daniel is telling us to go back and see where this phrase is first used. And it's no surprise, is it, that Genesis 10 and Genesis 11, where we come across this phrase, which is no longer used again until Daniel decides to pick it up under inspiration, it's all to do with the Tower of Babel and the establishment of Babylon and how man challenged God. So notice a few things here. Verse 5 then of Genesis chapter 10, we come across this man called Nimrod. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in all the earth. He was a mighty hunter against the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter against the Lord. This is a man who stood in opposition of God. And what did he do? Verse 10, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, at the end of verse 10, in the land of Shinar. So this is where it all began. This is a man who challenged God, this great hunter in all the earth, this great man, a celebrity, a man who had a following, a man who had status. And here he challenges Yahweh, the God of Israel. And then we come to Genesis chapter 11. And it says there, the whole earth was of one language at this time, in Genesis 11, of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, notice, a language, a phrase that's not going to be used again for another 1,000 years. They dwelt there. And they said one to another, go to, let us make brick and burn it throughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime they had for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build us a city as a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And we know this story, don't we? We know the story of the Tower of Babel, where these men got together to build a tower, to defy Almighty God. And there they were with one language, and God then dispersed them. He scattered them and changed their language. We know the story well. But isn't it interesting that it all happens in the land of Shinar? That phrase that we read in Daniel chapter 1. And notice as well how they built this tower. Notice there at the end of verse 3, they had brick for stone and slime they had for mortar. You may have a different term there for slime. Have a look in your margin. What do you find? Bitumen. The very word that is used by Nebuchadnezzar in describing the great tower that was restored in the land of Shinar, which became the temple of Marduk. And how interesting it is as well, because we know this story well, that there were men and women and they came together in objection against God to build something in defiance. And God dispersed them and changed their language. And what does Nebuchadnezzar do? He brings them all back to the land of Shinar. And he gives them one language, the language of the Chaldeans. In other words then, he's challenging God. He's reversing the curse there. Can you see that? And those of us who are familiar with the book of Daniel will know that this is a man who stood up against God. And that's illustrated so powerfully in Daniel chapter 3, where he challenges God with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. This was the image that the king set up. Remember that phrase that runs all the way through Daniel chapter 3? The king had set up. So isn't that interesting? And so what we're seeing then is that the treasures there were placed in the Tower of Babel, in the house. And in those opening words in Daniel chapter 1, we read that a treasure house was made in this temple. And God, there's the patience of God. He watched, he waited, and he allowed until he intervened that night in Daniel 5 when the curtains were drawn on the kingdom of Babylon. Amazing, isn't it? What's also fascinating, and there's a lot of disputing really over the names. It's very easy when we're looking at Hebrew names because the accuracy in names is retained in history. It's very difficult when you look at other civilizations. We know that the name Daniel was changed to Belteshazzar. But we also know, if we read carefully the book of Daniel, that name didn't stick. Even Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, when she's talking to her son, Belshazzar, in Daniel chapter 5, tells him that he should call upon a man called Belshazzar, but she refers to him as Daniel, or Belteshazzar, and she refers to him as Daniel. That was a name that didn't stick. Now, when you look at the meaning of the name Daniel, God is my judge, and that is a well-accepted name. When we look at the name Belteshazzar, a name that he was given, there's a bit of disputing. One translator has, may Marduk or Bel protect my life. But there is one translation, I'm not being dogmatic on this, but it's interesting. One translation has, the keeper of the hidden treasures of Bel. And I find that fascinating because we know that Daniel rose to dizzy heights in every single kingdom that he lived in. So was it then the responsibility of Daniel to oversee these treasures? It would be a natural thing for him to do, wouldn't it? To oversee the treasures of Yahweh in the Tower of Babel, in the treasure house. But we also know with King Nebuchadnezzar that what he did, he pillaged all the cities and he stole all the treasures and he sold all the best of the men and the women and he brought them into Babylon. So perhaps then Daniel had the responsibility of overseeing all the treasures that had been gathered around the world. He certainly had the qualities to do that, and we see that in Daniel chapter 6. He becomes the second in the Persian kingdom, doesn't he? Isn't that fascinating? How all these things dovetail together. Perhaps then Daniel, can you imagine that? Daniel going in and looking at the treasure house in the Tower of Babel, knowing what the Tower of Babel stood for. And as he looked at those golden treasures, he could see himself. He could see that those treasures were kind of symbolic of God's people. And they would one day return, as the treasures would one day return to the temple in Jerusalem. So there you have it then. Not a Christadelphian view. Robert Caldevet, the archaeologist who actually dug up in southern Iraq this very city. And his conclusion is, yes, Genesis 10 and 11 is true. Isn't that amazing? Bible archaeology is going all the way back to the time of Abraham. That's absolutely amazing. Young people, we can have absolute confidence in our Bibles. It's a subject in itself, but what's interesting is that Nebuchadnezzar did something to this ziggurat. He restores it with bitumen, but you'll notice a little blue building on the top, and that's what he did with it. He placed a new little building on the top. There's 7 levels, and then there's a temple. There's a temple. And they've even found archaeological evidence that as you go into this temple, placed upon, and I won't even describe the kind of things that went on in that temple. You can imagine. But in that temple, that's what Nebuchadnezzar did. In that temple, on the top of this ziggurat, as you go into the main room, you know what it's called? The Holy of Holies. There was Nebuchadnezzar, and he had stolen all these Jews who openly proclaimed Yahweh and God's word. And that's what he sticks on the top of his ziggurat, the Holy of Holies. No wonder the book of Revelation picks up this city and this empire and calls it the Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. What abomination. And so then there's an artist's impression. There's a temple there. And if you're standing down and you look at that building, which was over 100 meters high, which was the highest building right up to the Iron Age, with the exception of the ziggurat, the exception of the pyramids of Giza, it does, doesn't it? There's a staircase. That's what historians tell us. There was a staircase, 7 sets of staircases that went all the way up to the temple, and only the priestess of Marduk, could access the temple at the top. So there it is. Well, let me just share a few other things before we finish. A few things that stirred me up anyway. Can we have a look at 2 Kings chapter 24? So you may have heard of this tablet. It's called the Babylonian Chronicle. In fact, there's a series of them. They have various episodes. But this is a famed one found at the British Museum today. And all I want you to do, 2 Kings chapter 24, so we know, young people, when we look in the book of Kings and Chronicles, they're very factual, aren't they? Lots of lists and genealogies and numbers. Well, 2 Kings 24 is no different to that. So pick up the account in verse 8 and just run your eyes down, please, all of you, from verse 8 all the way down to verse 17. Just pick out some of the key words. And as you're going down those verses, let me just tell you what it's all about. Nebuchadnezzar goes into Jerusalem in 606 BC. He takes Daniel and his 3 friends, and he has an agreement with Jerusalem. And he finds the king here in this chapter betrays him. And so then he goes in, he destroys the city, and he places upon his throne, or the throne of Jerusalem, a family member, right, who is going to be Zedekiah. Okay? That's the account. We know this account. The Sunday school scholars know this account. And you can understand, can't you, why 2 Kings 24 is there, because this was a terrible moment in the Jews' history, when they are finally, all of them, taken into captivity for that 70-year exile to take place, something that was prophesied by Jeremiah 25. Well, what's equally fascinating is this Babylonian Chronicle, which was discovered in the middle of the 19th century, has this account in 2 Kings chapter 24, from verse 8 to verse 17, virtually word for word. And it was found in Babylon. And it's a record of what took place in Jerusalem when Jerusalem finally fell. And it's from their perspective how they triumphed Jerusalem. But the details here in 2 Kings chapter 24 is identical to this tablet, which was recorded by the Babylonians. I find that fascinating. And there's one little piece of information which I think is really interesting, which we don't get in the 2 Kings 24 record. I've got there the 16th of March, 597 BC. What we've got in this tablet is the very night that Jerusalem fell, which we don't read in 2 Kings chapter 24. It was the night, the 15th, 16th of March, 597 BC, when Jerusalem finally fell, when Nebuchadnezzar, with great rage, went into the city and ransacked the city and the temple. Isn't that fascinating? So a piece of historical record here that is absolutely consistent, word for word, of what you have in your Bible, but not a well-known section in your Bible, an obscure section in your Bible. How often do you go to 2 Kings 24? Very rarely. But there it is, word for word. Isn't that amazing? Completely written independently. These events took place. There's something else. What's happened here? What happened there? Anyway, so Nabonidus. So the genealogy, right? Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, Belshazzar. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar had daughters. Nabonidus married one of his daughters, so that Nabonidus became the son-in-law of Nebuchadnezzar. And Belshazzar was his son. And what we know now through history is that, through archaeological evidence, is that Nabonidus was fighting on the boundaries of the Babylonian Empire. He was in Arabia for 10 years. And this is why in Daniel chapter 5, Belshazzar can only give Daniel the third position within the kingdom. Because Nabonidus was out fighting. Belshazzar was the co-regent within Babylon. And so all he could do, given that his father was still alive, all he could do was give the third part to Daniel. And again, that was only discovered over 100 years ago. Isn't that amazing? This little bit of detail in Daniel chapter 5. Well, this is fascinating because Nabonidus, this was discovered again at the end of the 1800s. He's worshipping here the moon god Zin and the sun god Shamush. Right? I want you to notice the moon god Zin. Okay, so this is this big tablet here with Nabonidus worshipping these gods of the Babylonians. Now we come to the Chronicle of Nabonidus. And this is so fascinating. Does anyone know about the Chronicle of Nabonidus? It's a bit misleading because it wasn't written by Nabonidus. It was written during the time of the Persians. And it is believed commonly that it was the priest of Marduk who wrote this during the period of the Persians, which is an unusual thing, isn't it? Because Babylon had gone by that time. Now we have the Medes and Persians. So why on earth would the priest of Marduk be writing this? Well, we know in history that when Babylon was conquered, it was assimilated. It was absorbed into the Medo-Persian Empire. And many of these priests of Marduk continued their practice. And this tablet was found in Ur of the Chaldees, in a ziggurat. Okay, the very place that Abraham came from in Genesis 11. And you know what this tablet says, this chronicle says? It's from the priest of Marduk, and they're expressing frustration with this man, with Nabonidus. Because now it's in the dynasty of Cyrus. And in this tablet they're saying, if only Nabonidus had worshipped the moon god Zin, we wouldn't have got ourselves into this situation. If only he had truly devoted himself to the moon god Zin, we wouldn't have Cyrus today. The Babylonian Empire would have continued. And so I put it to you, just think about that for a moment. I think that's absolutely amazing. Why do you think Nabonidus hadn't fully committed himself to the gods of the Babylonians? Why? What do you think? Who was his father? Nebuchadnezzar. He'd seen a young Daniel interpret the image in Daniel chapter 2. He'd seen 3 men go into a fire that had been heated 7 times, with one like the Son of God standing in the midst. In Daniel chapter 4, he had seen his father become a beast for 7 seasons, for 7 times, and restored. Nabonidus has seen all those things. How could he ever fully commit himself to the gods of Babylon? Isn't that amazing? I think that's amazing. And here now they're venting their frustration over Nabonidus. We wouldn't have had Cyrus. We wouldn't have the Persian dynasty If only the Babylonians and the leaders that ran this country had devoted themselves to the true gods. You can understand, can't you, where they were coming from. I find that absolutely amazing. So that's the Chronicle of Nabonidus. Two more artifacts before I sit down. The cylinder at Nabonidus, right? So this was written during the time of Nabonidus. Now, there was lots of mention of Nabonidus. Nabonidus is not found in the book of Daniel, but there's lots of evidence of Nabonidus. There is no evidence whatsoever of the man called Belshazzar, which is really difficult, isn't it? Let's have a look at Daniel chapter 5. That's a hard one, isn't it, to reconcile? Daniel chapter 5, the very chapter that describes the curtain being drawn in this feast, this banquet, the most foolish king that ever lived in my mind, Belshazzar. And he receives the writing on the wall. The kingdom brought to an end. There is Belshazzar. There, Belshazzar, there, verse 1. Couldn't be any clearer, could it? Well, there's a problem. There was no archaeological evidence. And so then, if you go back 150 years and you look at some of the historical journals, they were disputing the veracity of God's word. This was under question. Until Nabonidus' cylinder was found in 1854. Nabonidus, the father of Belshazzar. Look at this. If you haven't seen this, you can see this in the British Museum. I find this amazing because, again, you look at this archaeological evidence and it sings true to what we know from God's word. So here is Nabonidus, and as with any parent, particularly fathers, worrying about their sons. We've all been there, haven't we? Well, this father was no different. And he's praying to Marduk, and he's concerned about his son. And he wrote these words. As for Belshazzar, the eldest son, the offspring of my heart, the fear of thy great divinity cause thou to exist in his heart, and let not sin possess him, let him be satisfied with the fullness of life. That's an expression of concern of any father, isn't it? Well, what is he saying to his God? Show my son some wisdom. Reveal yourself to my son. Let him be wise. And then we look at Daniel chapter 5 and the foolish banquet that he hosted, where he brings in all the golden vessels from the temple. And soon as those vessels touched those lips, the hand appeared and the writing on the wall. So perhaps then, Nabonidus knew all about Belshazzar's foolishness. Maybe he knew that he had an inkling for banquets and feasts. Who knows? But it rings true, doesn't it? This is a father concerned about his wayward son, I would suggest. And Daniel chapter 5 is testimony to that. So the final thing before we finish here. So something that's not widely known and very little has been written about it for some reason or other is this Aramaic fragment that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We all know about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Very few of us, I'm sure, will know about this Aramaic fragment. I might be wrong. But in the pots of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or these jars, they found this fragment, right? And what I will say, the vast majority now of historians and archaeologists believe that it's authentic. There are a few. There are a few who still dispute it. So I want to make that point clear. I want this to be as factual as I can. But the vast majority, mainstream view now, the consensus is that this is true, that this is authentic. And these are the words, right? So this is an Aramaic fragment found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's about one of the kings. We don't know which king it is, so it can only be 4. We've already looked at them. And he says these words. I was infected with a nasty disease for many years, says the king, but when I confessed my sins and my faults, he granted me a favourable verdict. So he's talking to Marduk. Marduk cured him. But then he writes, and there was a Jew. And he wrote and told me to give honour to his God. And isn't it interesting that he calls this God the God Most High? If you're there in the book of Daniel, and we've got these references on the screen, but you know, don't you, of all the descriptions of God that is recorded in Daniel, it is the Most High God that ruleth in the kingdom of men. We know that. Isn't that amazing? Shall we just read these together? Because, again, it's something that stirred me up. Daniel then, chapter 3, verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth, to the burning fiery furnace. There they are, 3 men, the 3 friends of Daniel, with one like the Son of God there in the midst. And spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God. That's something that Nebuchadnezzar knew. He could see what was happening before his eyes. It was amazing that these 3 men and another were not only surviving, but they were walking around in the furnace, and they were talking with one another. He couldn't believe what he saw. Go to chapter 5 now. And this is something that Daniel says concerning when he's speaking to King Nebuchadnezzar. O thou king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honour. Here he's speaking to Belshazzar, which is the grandson, not the son, the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And so this king then knows all about the Most High God. And then you go down to verse 21, where we're reminded of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God. That was a phrase that would have been known in this kingdom. The Most High God. The Most High God shook Nebuchadnezzar. He shook him to the ground, quite literally. And so in this Aramaic fragment, the very phrase, the Most High God, I find that anyway. I find that absolutely amazing. So I'm going to leave that with you. That's all I'm going to cover tonight. Very few archaeologists have appeared at the front of Time magazine, and here was one, Nelson Glueck, a very famous American Jew. He discovered over 1,500 sites. He's at the front of Time magazine, a highly reputable archaeologist from many of the leading universities, including Harvard in America. A brilliant, brilliant man. Well, what's interesting about this man is that he dug in the very areas that we're concerned about in the Bible, right? In the very areas. And this is what he says. As he reflects, he's now a retired archaeologist, he's now dead. But at this point in time, he was a retired archaeologist, and he's looking back upon his life, and he's been in 1,500 digs. He's seen thousands and thousands and thousands of things out of the earth, all over the Middle East. And this is what he says. And I say this to you, young people. He says, as he reflects upon his life, as a matter of fact, it may be clearly stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted or has ever conflicted or contradicted a single, look at that, a single biblical reference, a non-believer. I find that absolutely staggering. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible. I put it to you, young people, tonight, and thank you for listening. I can see you all still listening to me. Thank you. Bible archaeology proves to us that historically the Bible is true. That's an amazing thing. That's an amazing thing. So I put it to you, and the young ones in the audience in particular. You can trust the Bible. You can do more than that. You can trust the Bible with your life. Thank you.